What's poppin'? Miss Evans on the beat, so tap in. You got options, but you better pass my class, no flopping. Gon' log in every day, every morning I'm watching. Yeah, we virtual and you know it's up, so we about to take it up a notch. My role is the best, no comparing.
Welcome to Perspectives on Social Justice, where we continue to give the world a voice. I am Lyra Lane White, your host, and we are glad to be here today. Now, they say that education is the process of facilitating learning or the acquisition of knowledge, skills, values, beliefs, etc. They also say that education frequently takes place under the guidance of educators. However, learners have been challenged this year in many ways to educate themselves. The pandemic has challenged various models of educational methods, particularly online and in-person teaching. And now education systems across the country are debating the issue of mask wearing. So tonight I have some unique authorities on education to talk about some of these various challenges. We have Dr. Andrea Lewis, who is the Education Department Chair at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. We also have Dr. Angela Strong Green, who is the Distance Education Coordinator at Augusta Technical College. And we have the Reverend Velma E. Grant, who is a high school educator and happens to be the senior pastor of the Flipper Chapel AME Church in Fayetteville. Thank you, ladies, for being with us tonight. We're going to go straight into our discussion. And why don't we just start out? Let's just open up and just talk about what is your perspective thus far on reopening of the schools in the wake of the pandemic. And we talked earlier in the year. I think we talked back in August. We checked back in with you ladies in December, and now we're at the end of the school year. So we're excited to hear your perspective on things. Anybody?
I think that the reopening of schools needs to be very planned out carefully in terms of not just safety, but the mental health of the students, especially students who have been virtual all year long, whether that is, P-12 students or college students. I think that we need to make sure that we are still following COVID parameters and mitigation efforts, because COVID is still out here. It hasn't gone anywhere. So we need to make sure that students are still wearing their masks and taking safety precautions in terms of spacing, as well as putting in some social emotional learning efforts that have already been in place, but even ramping them up, because again, those students who have been online for a whole entire year, even more than a year since March 2020, I think we need to look at their mental health and put in some initiatives in the schools to ensure that our students are okay, not only educationally, but also emotionally as well.
I mean, to piggyback off of what you said, I think you hit the nail on the head that any plan to reopen schools at any level, whether it's, P through 12 or higher education, has to be comprehensive. And we can't take for granted that schools are absolutely, cathedrals of learning, but they are also like socially functional within communities. They are resources to meet people's basic needs related to hunger and mental health care. And that as we think about these plans to reopen schools, part of that might really need to include reevaluating and restructuring curriculum, for the many hardships that students have faced in this digital environment. So many of them have really acquired some skills that have allowed them to shine. A lot of what we say when we talk about digital natives, students have been able to acquire that kind of skill set much earlier now than they normally would, which frees up some time and space in the curriculum to take care of some of those social and emotional needs that they have that may not have been met as we dealt with the pandemic. So I absolutely agree that, these plans need to be comprehensive in how they look at opening things, but they also need to think about where can we restructure curriculum? What have people learned? What can we cut? What can we move into other areas? And, is there any merit to things like implementing year-round school in the years following the pandemic and the immediate years following the pandemic to make up for some of what's been lost?
Amen. Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis and Dr. Strong Green. I certainly agree with everything that you said. I would also hope that the parents that would be considered, I would hope that the parents would have an input in regards to the reopening of the schools. And I'm not just talking about, those affluent parents who are so gung-ho about having their children not wear masks. I think we should also make sure that we listen to those parents who still would like to make sure that their children are allowed to wear masks, because despite the CDC's guidelines now, new guidelines that say that if you're vaccinated, then you don't have to wear masks, we still don't know what percentage of even teachers, if you will, or other individuals I have been vaccinated. And so if I had children in through 12, I would certainly want to make sure that my voice is heard in terms of if I want my child to still continue wearing a mask, that the child would still have that opportunity to wear a mask, not be ridiculed or demeaned because of that decision. Another thing I hope that the authorities would consider, we know that some of our kids did not have access to technology like other kids. And so, of course, they might have fallen behind, they might have fallen off the grid. So what will our school administrators do to make sure that the technology that's required or necessary for those kids who have been left behind because of the lack of technology, that they will be applied adequate technology?
Mm-hmm. And speaking of technology, so because we know that a lot of kids did not have access to computers as well as a stable internet link, we know that that's part of what's contributing to the lag. When I say lag, I mean the progress that kids would have made. Um, uh, how do you think that this will affect children in the long run? Like, what is their recovery time? Is there recovery time? Will they be able to recover, or should we just kind of just do remedial? I mean, how would that affect how would that affect how educators should engage curriculum in the coming year and the summer?
I remember when there was an enormous discussion surrounding the push to teach for test because of No Child Left Behind legislation. And honestly, it transformed the way that education worked and the emphasis that we placed on standardized testing. And I certainly believe that the pandemic has done that as well in education, that on the other side of this, education can't and shouldn't and won't look the same. So we're very much stuck in kind of a system that's motivated by things that were happening at the turn of the century or in the early 1900s, and this kind of industrialized model where we teach things like reading, writing, and arithmetic, and where we group children based on the most important quality being their age. And that the pandemic has certainly proven that that is not the most important thing when we start structuring classrooms, that issues of equity matter, issues of access to materials and physical space, like those things matter. And so on the other side of this experience, it would be just one of those things that was so momentum launching, to be able to, instead of approaching the return from a place of remediation, to approach that from a place of equity, where we start to say, you know what, let's group these students together and give them the opportunity to access this technology and access additional support to help get them caught up to where their classmates may be, and not call that remediation, because it's not remediation, it's equity in education. It's ensuring that everybody has the access to the same resources. So, I mean, in a dream scenario, I hope situations like that happen, but I certainly hope that, you know, administrators and educators on the other side of the pandemic start discussions by thinking about how the most important thing about kids is not that they all physically live within a certain parameter of the school, or that they all happen to fall within a 1.5 year age range, that there are certainly way more important things that we need to think about and that we have to take into consideration after they've been apart so long.
I agree with the equity and access piece. I think that's huge. Children are resilient, but you know, many of the larger school systems were able to provide technology devices for students to be able to stay on track. But smaller school systems, especially in rural areas, were not. So I think that in terms of the equity and access piece, we need to ensure that those students who are not provided with technology and even Wi-Fi spots to access the teacher's work, we need to make sure that those children are provided for. And there probably needs to be a slower start and a heavy emphasis on review next academic year when school starts, and not have the expectation that all students are going to be ready to perform on the same level. Again, a slow, steady start to the school year, just to ensure that there is not a lot of and not only the lag from the school year, but then we'll also be dealing with summer slide that is usual in any school year. So those things will all need to be taken into account as we begin school in August or September.
And as we as educators, begin to get ready for the next school year, I'm certain that teachers already have an idea as to which additional push. And so if we start the new school year with that in mind, recognizing which students will need the extra push, the additional push, and move towards that, I think it will benefit the students as well. And not necessarily, like Doctor said, labeling it remediation. No, let's not do that, because of course, we don't want our kids to have any additional stigmas. Okay, we don't want them to feel as if they are less than. We don't even want them to feel that they are behind their classmates as well. So, we'll keep in mind that the student might need some additional push, might need some additional help, and just gear ourselves to move towards that, so we can help the students, because they've experienced so much. And while we as adults, we do have our emotional issues as well, but we can rally much more than these younger ones, because for all of them, this is the first time that they have been in this situation. I mean, for us, yes, but we're adults. But then it's much more difficult for the kids. Some of them thrive on that social interaction. Some of them will do much better in the social setting, learn much better with their peers than they were learning at home. So we just need to keep those things in mind as we get ready for the new school year.
Absolutely. We do need to keep those things in mind. And I really do appreciate what has been said about educational equity, because that has been a long-standing challenge, especially when we talk about social justice issues in education, in particular, going back to the entire the separate but equal in education, going back to the Supreme Court ruling, and going back to integrating the traditionally white schools. And so the issue exists even today. What can school systems do? How can we resolve the education, the equity in education problem from you guys' perspective? How do we resolve that? Especially, and I think it's very important that we be intentional. That school systems, I guess I'm answering the question myself, that school systems be very intentional, especially now, from a justice issue, to make sure that equity is at the top. But what should school systems be doing, and then what should our federal government be doing? Secretary of Education be doing?
So I think there are two answers to that question. And in my mind, the first is that they should be very intentional with federal funding. I mean, the CARES Act has provided for an enormous amount of money, and that money is not inherently meant to be spent in like systematic ways. It's not, we developed this program, but it is to address immediate needs caused by the pandemic. So if you know that you have, 20% of your population at your school didn't have access to Wi-Fi spots, your CARES money is to create Wi-Fi spots for those students, and not necessarily to think about, hey, how do we find Wi-Fi and apply Wi-Fi for the entire school and for everybody at the school who may potentially need it. Start with those who need it so that they aren't falling further behind. And I think that has to be very intentional, and that it needs to be based on needs assessments and actually asking people what it is you need and listening to their response, because you're going to find across the nation that what people need is very different, and it's going to, be based both on where they're at in their education journey and their life circumstance. So I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing that I think we need to do, I do a lot of professional development at my institution. And one of the things that I sort of sometimes do is I theme things. So like, this is going to be the year of service learning, or this is going to be the year of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I promise you 2022 needs to be the year of paraprofessionals, lab assistants, and teaching assistants, because creating these communities of equity and, helping to close these gaps cannot be just an educator's responsibility. They can't be teaching in the virtual and face-to-face environment without any support. And we have to remember that, yes, educators are an important part of the system, but there are also support staff for educators. Having lab assistants to help students, having teaching assistants that are available to help run some of these programs that can close those skills gaps, I think is going to be vitally important, and honoring those roles, not thinking of paraprofessionals as people who couldn't make it in teaching, but thinking of paraprofessionals as a very important and vital part of the education community that helps to close these kinds of gaps, is going to be important in, helping us to get to where we're going on the other side of this.
And here's what I would say as well. We have to hold the superintendents accountable, because we have to make sure that the superintendents of the school districts, that they're looking at the south side, they are looking at the north side, east and west, and that they are not just allocating funds just to the affluent area. So they have to embrace equity as well. Hold the school board accountable. That's why we elect them, right? So that they can represent us adequately. And of course, hold the principals accountable. If you know that your school is missing resources, then you have to be an advocate for your school. And of course, we have to hold the parents accountable as well. If something is missing from your school, your child needs additional resources, then you have to be that advocate for your child. So, we have to hold each other accountable from the top to the bottom, because that's the only way that we can make sure that all our children are receiving the resources that they need.
Another word that I would use beside intentionality and accountability would also be creating opportunities and making sure that the school systems are creating intentional opportunities for students, whether that be through extended learning programs, or even further clubs and organizations that the students missed who were virtual in the previous year, but just being intentional about opportunities and learning communities and learning environments that the children will be engaging in next year as well. So all of those things, I think, answer your question: intentionality, accountability, and opportunities.
Right. We definitely need to hold those persons, especially the elected officials, accountable for doing what they need to do. And then on a federal level, you guys, we talked to you spoke a little bit about what to do on a local level, but I think that we've just elected a new administration, and we have received a brand new chief of education, which is a far more qualified, if I can put my 2 cents in, far more qualified person to be the the Secretary of Education than the last person on the administration. What should they
Thank
be
you, Jean.
doing on the? I know, right? Okay. What should they be doing on a federal level? I mean, I have my own opinions, but I'd love to hear from you guys on that.
Sending money to the school systems. Schools need more than just state funding to operate and thrive, especially in impoverished areas. So if the federal government could send forth more funds for initiatives, and not necessarily, that are tied to testing and assessment, but funding to help with community resources and the mental health of students. I think that all of those things, in addition to curricular decisions, that extra funding would go a long way in assisting the students, especially to recap some of that learning that may have been missed during pandemic learning.
I also think that investments in infrastructure really matter. And I don't inherently mean in, building larger classrooms so that, students can actually socially distance. I also mean in thinking about building a technology infrastructure that can support digital learning. If you have students who are not ready to return to that face-to-face environment, then create an environment where they can learn from home, where there aren't these issues of equity and access to Wi-Fi, where they have computers that they can access. And so I know that that's always very sticky when you're dealing with federal funding, but being able to create spaces and build the infrastructure is going to matter. And it's especially going to matter moving forward because, as we said, this virus is transforming, and who knows if a more aggressive variant will come out and create a situation where we once again need to return to this type of learning environment. And if we do, let us be more prepared.
Yep. Agreed.
Amen. And I would also add again accountability. And so if we are going to be allocating federal funds to the state, and we need to make sure that the state is not being partial in where those funds are sent. We would need to make sure that the funds that are sent by the federal government are not just staying in the Republican side of town and leaving the Democrats lagging or vice versa. So again, accountability is critical, even at the federal level.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then when we talk about accountability at the federal level needs to hold school systems accountable. What we saw in the last presidential administration was the president of the United States intervening by saying, "Hey, we're going to cut funding for this, that, and the other if you don't reopen." Well, in the same way that in the same way that that the federal level can flex its muscles, if you will, then I like to see that done in a more constructive way right now, and it needs to happen right now. And there needs to be funding also that is dedicated to the teacher development of all things. One of the things that caught us off guard, in my opinion, for the pandemic is that the teaching models, the traditional teaching models did not adequately prepare us. And we didn't know. We had no way of knowing that a pandemic was going to come. But the current teaching models didn't fit the need that didn't fit the demand for the need to teach online and to teach virtually. And so we need to increase funding, in my opinion, to reframe the various teaching models. More research needs to go into curriculum planning, curriculum development, And all of those things can be done from the federal level. Finally, as we get ready to close out, I want to get your opinion. I've talked to several parents about how they felt about standardized tests. What is your perspective on standardized testing, especially in the wake of, children are graduating, they want to get into schools, they want to be promoted to the next grade level, and so many of those criteria are based on the results of standardized tests. What can we do? And what has been the impact, number one, because of the pandemic, and what can we do to mitigate the fallout from standardized tests? You guys say what?
I might have the unpopular opinion, but I think that standardized tests need to be paused for a moment while students are learning and reacclimating themselves to in-person learning. So that's my thought. That maybe just put a pause on standardized tests for a year while we transition back to face-to-face learning and students kind of recoup some of the learning loss that they have experienced from the pandemic.
But are we adequately evaluating kids when we talk about moving to the next school level, the next grade level, if we don't have some form of testing or evaluation?
So I think that there's something
you can have some,
about using. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Dr. Strong Green, and then Reverend Grant.
So I think there's something to be said about using matrix approaches. Matrices can let you know a variety of things, right? And so I work at an open access institution, and I think that makes very clear what my belief about standardized testing is. I find it completely pointless. You cannot tell a student that they are or aren't college ready based off of their ability to pass a single placement test in reading. Exactly. I think that you can look at their reading scores. You can also look at, how long they're willing to work on a project and potentially not see a result. And that tells you just as much about the student's ability to succeed in college as that test will. And so I think as we begin to look at this, yes, use that as a way of gauging whether or not a student is ready to move forward, but it cannot be the only way. I work in distance education, and one of the things that we celebrate is, making content accessible and a universal design and learning. And so course design and course development are two different things. Designing a system where multiple people can succeed is one thing, and then developing the materials for that, which is all of the stuff we're saying about equity, really matters. But being able to say, here are a combination of things that we're going to use to assess whether you're ready to move forward in the next level. And if you can meet the criteria of X, Y, and Z within these things, then you're ready to move forward. Even if you fail on one or two of them, is a much smarter and I think a more inclusive approach to helping students succeed.
Reverend Grant?
Right. I was going to agree with Dr. Lewis in saying that we need to put a pause on the standardized tests for a while until the students can get back into the classroom and get back into that mode of studying, that mode of learning that we're all familiar with. I think for them to be taking standardized tests right now, it's too much pressure for them. They are already experiencing pressure as it is. And so to put that additional stress of, passing the standardized test, if you get a certain score, if you don't get a certain score, it's just too much pressure on our young people right now. They don't need that. Right now, they just need to recuperate and survive this pandemic.
Dr. Grant, you actually bring up another really important point in my mind. I love education. I don't ever want to do anything else, but I often thought to myself, especially in the area that I live in, which has experienced a population boom, that if I tried another career, it would be opening up a daycare. And I've sort of shifted in the post-pandemic mentality away from I should start a preschool into I should start a proctoring service, because I think if we continue to take the standardized testing approach while people are working from home, that those tests are going to require proctors in order to ensure the integrity of the exam, and creating an infrastructure where we focus on making sure that the exams are secure, it's just a waste of our resource right now. Like there are other more important things to deal with, and it just creates an additional stress. So as you're talking about taking care of their emotional needs, let us not waste resources building proctoring systems for these tests when we could be, you know, taking care of actual students.
Right. Well, I
Right.
thank you, ladies, for joining us tonight. I see Dr. Lewis had to drop off, but her opinion was, I'm pretty sure she probably concurs with each of you, especially when it comes to the use of standardized tests. My concern is that because of the pandemic, and because if we don't use standardized testing, and I do get your point, Dr. Strong-Green, about the use of standardized tests, how are we going to effectively evaluate where our children are, and where, and when we talk about remediation, although we won't call it remediation, which direction will we take our kids in? And so it's an ongoing discussion. Right now, the hot topic is, should we mask or should we not mask? Which I feel, that's a conversation that I think school systems probably need to be more focused on. Equity, as you mentioned, Dr. Strong-Green, we need to be more focused on holding school systems and elected officials accountable, as you said, Reverend Grant, as opposed to whether you put on a mask or not. In 6 months, as our vaccinations begin to wear off and we are all in need of a booster shot, we probably we're going to have to put the mask back on anyway. So I just feel like, we need to dedicate our time to talking about other more important things when it comes to education. But I want to thank everybody. I thank you guys for being a part of this discussion. We will resume our conversation in the fall which I'm sure there's going to be more controversy as the kids get ready to go back to school from the summer. And we're going to keep talking about, the status of education, and still be talking about it in the wake of COVID-19. So in the meantime, I want to thank everyone for listening. And as we leave you, I leave you all with those famous words from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, that whatever affects one of us directly affects us all indirectly. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Welcome to Perspectives On, where we're giving the world a voice. We are a faith-based social justice forum where individuals give their perspectives on various topics. It's an opportunity to express their viewpoint, their stance, and their angle on justice issues affecting the community and globally. Each episode features guests presenting their perspective on things like climate change, the church, urban farming, and food insecurity, all through a unique faith lens. Come check us out. Give us your